And it is 9 o'clock here on the Eastern time zone. And I would like to say, welcome this evening. And I am ready to get rocking and rolling. I hope that you all have been having a good week. I have been having a very, very busy week, and I haven't had much time at all to make connections online with anybody. So I've missed you all, and I am glad to be here this evening. All right. Well, I'm Connie Stapleton, and this is Food Addiction, Fair and Firm. Called that, of course, because food addiction is real. That's what the FAIR stands for. The firm is freedom from addiction, is in recovering mindfully. We haven't talked too much about that mindfully concept, that mindfulness yet in this series, but we will be getting to that. However, tonight we are going to continue with what we were talking about last week. Last week, the topic was why me? And tonight I'm going to continue in that same vein, because a lot of times people wonder, why me? Why am I an addict? Why now? Why did this show up at this time in my life? Those are all really good questions. And while I don't have any specific answer, while there is not one accurate answer in and of itself, there are many possibilities and there are many factors that go into the creation of one becoming and acting out an addiction. We talked last week about the fact that addiction is in many ways a very biological disease. It's a brain disease. Patrick Carnes, who is one of my favorite addiction authors and speakers and gurus, I guess you might want to say, says that addiction is the only disease in which we do not treat specifically the organ that is diseased. He's referring to the brain when he says that. It's not like we go in and we do, lobotomies to treat addiction. If you're dealing with food addiction and you have had weight loss surgery, a lot of times you'll hear people in the weight loss surgery community talk about, nobody did surgery on our brains. And they're referring to the fact that there's a lot of emotional stuff that goes on after weight loss surgery as one loses the weight, and a lot of things begin to change. But there's also a lot of brain chemistry that's going on. And I like to help people understand during my pre-surgical evaluations that they need to take a look and examine whether or not they think they may be struggling with some food addiction issues. Because if they are, and they have the surgery, the addiction hasn't been treated, the addiction hasn't been acknowledged, the addiction is alive and well, as they say, although it's wreaking havoc. So there's nothing well about the effects of addiction. But if you're having weight loss surgery, you're dealing with two diseases simultaneously if you have a food addiction. So you've got addiction, you've got obesity, both diseases, both needing treatment, both medical and psychological. So you have weight loss surgery, that's to treat the biology of the obesity, yet you've still got the addiction component. And it's going to win. It's going to win over that surgery. And if you're addicted to food, you're going to return to that substance or you're going to find another substance. Sadly, we've seen in the bariatric community that a lot of people turn to alcohol following weight loss surgery, or pain medication gets taken in an abusive, addictive manner. Shopping can get out of control. But tonight we're going to talk about why. Why me? Why am I an addict? So we talked last week, and Dr. Vera Tarman, who wrote Food Junkies, an amazing book, along with Philip Wardell, talks a lot about the biology of addiction. She explains how the brain is triggered, the euphoria that is turned on in the brain for a lot of people, for those people oftentimes who are food addicts, And once that switch is turned on, it's very difficult to turn it off unless you remain abstinent from whatever foods are your triggers, from whatever foods are your addiction foods. So there's a lot of biology going on, and there's no denying that. There's a lot of research that shows that food and other drugs and substance of abuse and dependence trigger a lot of the same areas of the brain. There's also another school of thought that talks a lot about the emotional history of those people who are addicts, whether it's related to food or alcohol or drugs or whatever it is. Personally, I subscribe to both theories. I think both physiology and a person's upbringing are often both times at play if a person is an addict. That is not to say that one can't strictly have biological issues or biological predispositions for food addiction or any other addiction and not have had trauma in their childhood, which we began to talk about last week. In my experience as a recovering person myself of 20, I don't know, what are we going on, 28 years, or 29, I can't remember, 5489, whatever 89, however many years ago that was. And in my professional experience, and I have worked in the field of addiction, both in the field of alcohol addiction and treatment, in the field of different drugs of abuse, addiction and treatment. I've been certified in sex addiction and the treatment of sex addiction, and I've worked very extensively with food addicts and the healing and recovering from all those different addictions. And in my experience, the vast majority of people have had some psychological wounding, meaning their self-esteem has been damaged, and very often it's in the early years of life. That doesn't mean always, okay? So when I'm talking tonight, remember, I'm not saying that every person who's an addict has had a terrible childhood. I'm not saying that at all. And I also want you to remember very clearly that abuse and neglect are on a continuum. I would say that almost every human being, somebody asked me last week after I got off the Facebook Live, they texted and they said, doesn't every family have dysfunction? And I would say to one degree or another, almost every family has some form of dysfunction. Now that dysfunction can range from very, very slight things to extremely horrendous forms of dysfunction and everywhere in between. So I want you to remember that. I want you to think about your family that you grew up in as I speak tonight about some of these different issues. And I want you to think about the family that you have created, whether that's a biological family, where you have children, whether they're adopted, whether they're biological, whether you have a husband, a wife, whether you have a lifetime partner, whatever your family is. If it's just close friends, I consider 3 women in my life to be absolutely the closest members of my family, other than the family that my husband and I have created. So, family can be whatever it is that means to you. And there's dysfunction in most families, right? Even if it's friendships. So tonight, I want you to listen carefully, and I want you to listen with an open mind, because some of the things that I'm going to talk about can hit home in a way that you want to utilize that defense mechanism of denial and say, this never happened to me, this did not happen in my family. And it may have. It may not have. But I want you to be open and honest about whether or not some of these things took place, okay? Because for me, and for a lot of people that I have worked with, the acknowledgement of any form of neglect or abuse within the family in which they were raised was extremely painful. Not something they were ready to deal with, not something they were willing to deal with. And it takes time. So if you're not there yet, if you're not ready, that's okay. All right, so just bear with me. Also, in the family that you have created, there's probably been some dysfunction along the way too. Does that make you a bad or horrible person? No, it makes you a human person. Because I've done some things in my parenting, I've done some things in my spousal role, I've done some things in my friendship roles, in my role as a daughter, a sister, a friend, that have just been ridiculous and atrocious at times. That's okay. It's about acknowledging what you're going to do about those things. That's where the healing comes from. That's where the healing from addiction comes from too. And as we heal from our addiction, translated means getting rid of any crap that we've got stored in the emotional closet, whether it's things that we have done, said, exposed people to that we feel bad about, that have hurt our shame, that have made us feel like, ugh, that's not okay, I'm not okay. Or whether it's things that we experienced as children that lent us to believe that in some way we weren't okay. That's what adds to our need to escape from our feelings, hence the addiction. So when we talk about these things, when we make them real, when we allow ourselves to say this happened and it affected me in this way, and this is how I feel about it, we free ourselves from some of that baggage that's been circulating within us in the form of negative energy, and we let it go. As we let that go and we're able to say, you know what, I didn't do anything to deserve that as a child, or I didn't do anything to cause that. And things we've done as an adult that we feel shame about, we can say, I did this. I feel horrible about this. I apologize for this. And then we can work toward letting that go too. And as we let go of shame, we feel better about ourselves. We find forgiveness for others. We find forgiveness for ourselves. The shame minimizes, and we're filled back up with the goodness we came into the world possessing. Okay? We were born with good stuff. We were born with self-love. We were born with love for other people, I believe. So the better we feel about ourselves, the less need we have to treat ourselves badly. Addiction is the way we treat ourselves badly. Because people with high self-esteem, with little shame, treat themselves well. And that's just the way it is. So the better we feel about ourselves, the less we torture ourselves with food, alcohol, drugs, the less we need to escape, and the better we'll treat ourselves in terms of the food we put in our body and the exercise, the energy we get burn off of our bodies. All right, so where am I headed with all this, right? All right, for an addict to blossom into an active addict, we've got to have a predisposition, right? Either biologically, most likely biologically to some degree. And then as Dr. Mattei, who I spoke about last week, who wrote In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, who also has a lot of YouTube videos that you can watch. They're all free. He says that there has to be stress. So there has to be a susceptible individual and there has to be stress. And if you read his material further, you'll find that stress is often in the form of chaos in an environment, or stress in the form of anxiety or fear or anger or tension. A lot of that stress, according to Dr. Mattei, occurs when a child is in their younger years. Remember, too, that last week I said that 60% of people who suffer from obesity have been sexually abused. That's not a statistic I made up. All right, you can look that up and find out for yourself. Sexually abused children have been abused. So even if you think that was a long time ago, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't bother me, I'm going to disagree with you. And I think that a lot of professionals would, until you sort through it. It does not mean reliving it. It's not about re-traumatizing. It's just about talking about it with someone you trust. A therapist, by the way, is a good person to do that with, because they cannot go and disclose this to anyone by law. There are times if records are subpoenaed that things could go to court. That is true. But it's unethical. And a therapist, anybody who's licensed, would lose their license if they shared that information with anyone unless it was subpoenaed by law. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about forms of neglect and forms of abuse. And I want you to think about, have I experienced any of this in my childhood, or have I doled that out as an adult? All right. And remember, if you experience this, it doesn't mean your parents or your caregivers or whomever were bad people. It means they were ill-equipped in some way. All right. So we're not going to blame. We're not going to say it's their fault. We're not going to hate them. We're going to say in some way they were ill-equipped. All right. So what I want to talk about first is neglect. Neglect, simply meaning, for the definition in this purpose, is the failure of whomever's in charge, whether it's a parent, a guardian, or some other caretaker, to provide for a child's basic needs. All right? So it's not saying it's, a horrible human being who neglects another. It's just the failure to take care of a child's needs. Now, neglect can come in a lot of ways. We're going to start with one that, some people have experienced and a lot have not, but it's medical neglect. So, for example, if people have different feelings about vaccinations, a lot of people would consider not having a child vaccinated as medical neglect. For other people, it's a different issue altogether. I'm not judging. I'm just saying that that's an example of what some people would consider medical neglect. Or if a child has a physical injury or an illness or some kind of medical condition and the parent doesn't get them treatment for it, that would be considered medical neglect. I'll give you an example of this from my own life. My son, when he was probably 3 or 4 years old, was at my father's house with my sister, who was 13, and they were babysitting her, and he fell and he cracked his head open. So when my husband and I got home, my sister told us that Stephen had cracked his head, and my dad had looked at it and said it was fine, didn't need stitches. So I was like, okay. So in the morning, I asked, I told Stephen, let me take your bandage off. I want to see the wound. I took one look at it and I thought, oh my God, this thing needs stitches. So we take him to the hospital. We're out of town. So we're in my hometown, and we get there and the nurse says, oh, it's been over 12 hours. He's not, the doctor's, it was a he, is not going to want to put stitches in that. And the doctor took one look at it and said, this is going to need stitches. So that was medical neglect, not because my sister was a bad person or my father was a horrible person. He just didn't think it needed stitches, but it did. Now, if I hadn't taken him, that would have been medical neglect on my part. Let's talk about educational neglect. If a parent doesn't make a kid go to school, if a child has some sort of disability, a learning disability or ADHD or a reading disability or whatever it is, and it's brought to the parent's attention and they opt not to get the child the help that the child needs, that would be considered educational neglect. Now, here's one that I think more people will be able to relate to, and that's emotional neglect. And that means when a child's emotional needs are not tended to, all right? So this can range, again, from minor things to major things. Most of us, I think, experience some emotional neglect, maybe because our parents just had too many kids and didn't have time in the juggling of school and after-school activities and their jobs and life to say to the kid every single day, how you doing and what's bothering you, and you look upset, and, it's not a horrible thing. Those could be itty-bitty little things. But let's say that a child has a parent die, or through divorce a parent moves away and are never heard from again, and the child never has anybody say to them, how are you doing with this? Or let's talk about how you feel, or checking in with the child from time to time. Maybe the parent who's left at home is so overwhelmed with finances and their own distress, or who knows what the circumstances are. But anytime a child goes through an emotional event that affects them and nobody checks in with them, again, it can be little bitty things that are overlooked on a daily basis, not because anybody's bad or wrong or whatever, to big issues. All right. So most of us have had some neglect that didn't really scar us for life. And then there are situations probably that have been pretty scarring in terms of emotional neglect. Okay, so perhaps in your childhood, you were physically neglected, or you were medically neglected, or you were possibly emotionally or educationally neglected. Here's a more important question for today. In what ways, get ready for it, in what ways are you neglecting yourself today? Do you neglect yourself medically? Do you not go to the physician because you're afraid you're going to get the lecture about eating less and moving more? Do you not go to the physician because you're going to be embarrassed to get up on that, OBGYN table and spread your legs? Do you not go because you're afraid people in the waiting room are going to be looking at you? Do you not go because you fear what the results might be? Are you medically neglecting yourself? Okay, remember, we need to care and love ourselves enough to get the medical care that we need, all right? Are you physically neglecting yourself? That would fall into the category of, do you exercise your body to whatever degree you're capable of doing? If all you're capable of doing are, some sitting in the chair yoga, then that's great if you're doing it. If all you can do is lift a soup can in either arm and you're not doing it, are you neglecting yourself? If you're capable of getting out of the house and walking around the block, are you neglecting to care for yourself in that way? What about the food that you put in your body? Speaking of physical neglect, are you neglecting to nourish your body by starving it, or by starving it of the nutrients it needs, or by not giving it enough water? Are you neglecting your body physically? Who can be the one to take care of that? Only you. Exactly. How about educationally? Did you drop out of school before you got a high school diploma? And is a GED something you want to get? Have you always wanted to go to college but never did? And you have the time maybe, or now you maybe have the financial means? If that's something you want to do and you're able to do it, are you neglecting yourself? And what about emotionally? Here's a big one, my friends, because addicts tend to neglect themselves. No, I'm going to say addicts abuse themselves emotionally in a lot of different ways. We don't ask for help. We beat ourselves up with stinking thinking. We compare ourselves. We're envious and we're jealous and we talk about other people, and we neglect ourselves emotionally and often abuse ourselves emotionally. And finally, I want you to think about the people in your life. Do you neglect them in any of those ways? Physically, medically, educationally, and emotionally. If you're the person who's their caregiver, you will feel better about yourself if you tend to the needs of those for whom you're responsible. And anytime you do something that you feel good about, you're increasing your self-esteem. And anytime we increase our self-esteem, we also increase our self-efficacy, which means, I can do this because I just did. So as we increase our self-efficacy, the belief that we can, and we increase our self-esteem, the less we neglect ourselves, the better we feel about ourselves, the better we treat ourselves, the less we need this addiction thing going on in our life. See how that all works together? Okay, so now we're going to talk about abuse. All right, now there's no surprise for anybody about what physical abuse might look like. It might look like pinching or biting or beating or kicking or punching or shaking or choking or tying or hitting or burning or stabbing or throwing. There are all kinds of horrible, horrible physical abuse things that I know have invaded the lives of many people that I know, that have altered their lives, that have altered their self-esteem, that have definitely negatively impact how a person feels about themselves and increased shame tremendously. Anytime a person is hit or abused physically, their shame is affected in a negative way. So, were you physically abused in any way as a child? Now, there's a big debate about spanking and whoopings and beatings and blah, 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 blah. I'm not a fan of physical punishment. I know a lot of people were brought up that way. I know a lot of people say it happened to me and it didn't, I'm fine, whatever, whatever. But I want you to consider how you felt at that time if this happened to you. Was it, was it humiliating? Was it embarrassing? Was it shaming? Were you angry? Because I believe that anybody who's hit is a bit angry, a bit resentful. But kids don't have the ability to strike back, right? Because they'll only get it worse. So to those people who say, this is how I was raised and I turn out fine, I say, just because something's been done for generation after generation after generation after generation doesn't make it right or healthy. Think about slavery, right? It took place for years and years and years, and I don't think there's any one of us who would say that that was an okay thing to do to another human being. So just because it was done for a long time doesn't mean it's the best option. That's all I'm going to say about that. You can have your own opinions, and I will respect them. All right, let's talk about emotional abuse. Here's something, again, I believe that most of us endured in our childhood, maybe on a very low end of the continuum, maybe to an extreme end of the continuum. And this could be by teachers, it could be by scout leaders, it could be by coaches, it could be by aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, neighbors, parents, siblings, anybody. But harsh criticism, right? Criticizing a person, making it personal, you're stupid or you're ugly or you're dumb or you're fat, that's really, really, why can't you be like your brother? Why can't you be like your sister? Comparisons, that wreaks havoc on a child's self-esteem, because remember, a child doesn't have the ability to say, you're having a bad day. It's not about me. So any kind of continual rejection, the withholding of hugs, the withholding of affection, the withholding of I love yous. I've had 50-year-old men sit in my office and say, I never heard my father say he loved me, and cry. Or people tell me, the one time I heard my parents say they loved me was on their deathbed. That's just sad. And if it wasn't a big deal, I wouldn't hear about it and see the tears that go with it, right? So any kind of vicarious abuse is emotional abuse. And what vicarious abuse means is seeing your brother or your sister or your mother or your father or your aunt or your uncle or somebody else being abused, whether it's verbally or physically or emotionally or sexually. Witnessing abuse, even between parents, is vicarious abuse because it causes emotional damage to children. All right. Substance abuse. If you grew up in a home where there was a lot of substance abuse or food addiction or, any kind of addiction, there are issues that go along with that, because maybe you felt sorry for your parent if they were overweight. Maybe you became a caretaker and that wasn't really your job. Or maybe you felt sorry for mom or for dad because they were being emotionally or physically abused by the other parent. Or maybe your sibling was always the one picked on and you felt angry and you felt helpless, powerless to help. So anytime there's vicarious abuse or substance abuse, because addiction creates havoc in families. They call addiction a family disease. And I so believe that, and we will get to that in a future episode. But for tonight, just know that there's abuse and neglect that come out of families in which addiction is alive and present. So that's a very quick overview. And of course, then there's sexual abuse, right? And sexual abuse can be physical, It can be just looks that are, just inappropriate. It can be talking about body parts to children that's inappropriate. It can be inappropriate sexual jokes around children. It can be comments about waitresses. It could be, it could be any stereotypical language like all men are pigs or all women are whores or, any kind of ickiness around that. Touching, fondling, pinching on the rear, grabbing, that kind of stuff is very inappropriate for children, right? Being exposed to pornography as a child, very inappropriate. Witnessing parents groping one another, any of that kind of stuff is very, very inappropriate. It's emotionally abusive. It's emotionally neglectful. I'm not teaching a child about their development, in terms of having a menstrual cycle or having a wet dream for a boy or those things that children need to know about before they happen. All right. So any kind of sexual abuse, all of this stuff, neglect, abuse, harms a child's self-esteem. All right. It's just a fact. That's not a maybe it does, maybe it does. To what degree depends on a lot of things. How much support there is in the family, if there's knowledge of any of these things going on, how much internal resiliency a child has, which we cannot measure, how much outside support, like maybe a teacher. If a parent is educationally neglecting a child, but a teacher kind of picks up the slack, depending on what else is going around, depends on how much damage is done to a child. But if you have experienced any of this, it's okay just to say, you know what, this affected me. If you've done any of these things, it's okay to say, I did these things and I'm sorry. So this is not about beating up on parents or aunts or uncles or cousins or teachers or coaches. It's about saying, this is what happened in my life from an objective perspective. This is how I felt about it. But we live in the present, and that's where our focus is going to be, okay? This is how I'm going to deal with that today. When I have memories or something triggers me and I want to eat in response to it, or I hear somebody's voice and all of a sudden I'm agitated and don't even know why. Because remember, in our brains, we have file cabinet after file cabinet after file cabinet of memories that are triggered all through the day that we're not even aware of. And sometimes we just feel a certain way and we turn to food or we turn to alcohol or whatever. That's how this relates to addiction in a couple of ways. First of all, if we've had these things happen and they're in us, our bodies remember, even if our brains don't specifically remember incidents or details. And we don't want to remember or deal with the feelings we had because we're going to experience those feelings at the same level at which we would have felt them. Let's say you were sexually abused at age 8 and we start talking about that. You're going to feel how you felt when you were 8. Who wants to feel like that when you're 50, right? So that's why you need therapy to deal with these kinds of things, because you don't want to get immersed in this or put through that stuff again. It's just about saying, I'm angry about what happened to me. I'm sad about what happened to me, and then realizing, working through and saying, that wasn't about me. I'm very sad it happened, but I realize now that I was lovable all along. And then you can stop treating yourself like you don't love yourself. You can stop treating yourself like you don't like yourself. You can stop treating yourself with disrespect out of your shame, because you're talking about it, you're getting rid of it, and when you get rid of shame, you fill back up with self-love. So then you're freer to eat well, exercise, engage in more parts of the world than just your addiction. So the freedom from addiction comes from addressing the neglect and the abuse, in addition to making sure that you're treating the brain stuff, the biology, the neurochemistry. And the only way to treat that, hopefully you know by now, is through abstinence. Abstinence of whatever your trigger substances are. Okay, there's been a lot said tonight, a lot of heavy stuff, but I want you to remember that this is all very, very hopeful because it's the way out. This is the way of healing. This is the way to wellness. This is the firm. Freedom is recovering mindfully. Mindfulness requires addressing unresolved issues. So that's where I'm going to leave it tonight, with the hope and the promise that as you address these things, you no longer have to feel the fear of the feelings, and you realize they're not going to gobble you up. You're not going to cry forever once you start. You're not going to get so anxious that you'll never come out of it. You're an adult. You get the support. You get the help from other people that you need. And then you experience the joys of living in recovery from addiction. And then what you do is you go out and you share it with other people so that they can experience those joys as well. All right, so let me remind you that all of these videos will be available on YouTube or on my website, which is www.conniestapletonphd.com. And I would really appreciate if you share these videos with anybody you think could benefit from them. Finally, remember, I am your recovery conscience. Listen to me over and over and then hear me when you're tempted to do something that's not going to lead you towards your meaningful matters. That's your goal, your vision for where you want to be. Will doing this lead me closer to or further from who I say I want to be? All right, your health, your responsibility this day and every day. And I will see you in the next day. Have a good one. Good night.